Welcome to this DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series we'll cover how to replace and keep filters in measures. We'll start by looking at how to replace a single filter in a measure, and then how to replace multiple filters at the same time. We'll explain how to use the KeepFilters function to retain filters, and we'll use that technique to create a filtered list of categories and show you how to exclude categories from a list. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report and I've already imported the data from our standard Excel Movies workbook. As usual, I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this file yourself and follow along with the video if you'd like to. All I've done since importing the data is tidied up the data model a little bit, and I've made sure to hide all of the ID columns just to keep the fields list a little bit clean and tidy when we build our visuals back in the report view. To get started in this report, I'm going to add a table to the report page, and in that table I'm going to display the genre field, and then I'd like to create a measure which shows the average runtime minutes for all the films. So in the All Measures table I'm going to right click, choose New Measure, and then I'm going to create a new measure called Average Runtime, or AVG runtime for short. And we're simply going to use the average function and look for the runtime minutes field in the film table. Having done that, and we've created the measure, we can delete the Delete Me column from the All Measures table, just to convert this into a proper measures table. And then when I've confirmed that I want to do that, we can add that measure into the table visual on the report page. Just to make sure we can see everything more clearly, I'm going to hide the filters panel, and then in the format pane I'm going to increase the font size of the values of that table up to about 13, and that should be a little bit easier to read. So far in this section of the tutorial, we've looked at how to apply new filters in a measure using a variety of functions, and in the previous video we looked at how to remove filters in a measure. In this video I'd like to look at applying filters in a measure using a column that's already being used to apply a filter. So in this table visual you can see that the genre column is being used to create a filter context for each row which affects the results returned by that average runtime measure. I'd like to create a new measure that calculates the average runtime, but just for a single specific genre. I'm going to pick science fiction for this first example. So to do that, I'm going to right-click the All Measures table and choose to create a new measure. And I'm going to call this one AVG Runtime Sci-Fi. And we'll make this one equal to the result of the calculate function. The expression I'd like to calculate is the average runtime, so I could create my average function again, but as I already have an average runtime measure, let's just reference it for convenience. Then the filter that I'd like to apply, I'm going to reference the genre field in the genre table and check where the value of that is equal to science fiction. At that point I can close the round brackets and hit enter, and then I can add that new measure to my existing table to see the end result. It shows me for every single genre, it shows the average runtime for science fiction films. So this tells us that the filter argument we've just created destroys the original filter context and replaces it completely with the one that we've just written. This sort of thing can be quite useful when you want to compare one specific category with all of the other categories in the same column. So to do that, let's create a new measure. I'm going to call this one AVG Runtime versus Sci-Fi. And then all we're going to do is subtract one measure from the other. So we'll say AVG Runtime minus AVG Runtime Sci-Fi. When we've created that, we can add that to the table visual, and then we can see this set of values as a column of numbers. And we can see which genres on average have a longer or shorter runtime than science fiction. This sort of thing looks a little bit better displayed either as a chart or maybe even as just data bars in the table. So let's just increase the column width there so we can see this a little more clearly. And then I'm going to right click on the average runtime versus sci-fi field in the values bucket in the field well, choose conditional formatting, and then choose data bars. I'd like my negative bars to be displayed in an obviously different colour. I'm going to pick orange for this example, and then click OK to see the end result. It's a little bit easier to see now which genres are particularly longer or shorter on average than sci-fi films. We can get an even more pleasing effect just by sorting this column by clicking on the column header there, and that looks a little bit more interesting to me. We can use the same basic technique to replace multiple filters in the same measure. To demonstrate this, let's create a new page in the report, and I'm going to add a matrix to that report page, and I'll just reposition that and resize it. And then in that matrix, I'm going to display the genre field in the rows bucket, the certificate field in the columns, and then the original average runtime measure in the values bucket. I'll just increase the font size of the values again to make it slightly easier to read. And then I'd like to create a new copy of that same matrix, which displays the average runtime sci-fi measure. So let's copy the matrix and then paste it next door. And then we can replace the average runtime measure with average runtime sci-fi. So you can see that for each column in the matrix, each certificate is displaying the average runtime of science fiction films for that certificate. What I'd really like to do here, though, is create a unique combination of science fiction and PG films, so that all of the cells in the entire matrix read the same value, 117.71. Doing that isn't too difficult. If I select the original measure that we've just created here, average runtime sci-fi, we can copy this, create a new measure, and then paste in all the code. I'll change its name so it's called average runtime sci-fi PG, and then simply add a second filter to the calculate function. So after genre equals science fiction, I can say certificate equals, and then PG. Once I've created that measure, I can swap out the average runtime sci-fi measure from that second matrix with the average runtime science fiction PG, and we'll see that every single cell in the entire matrix reads the same value, which is that same one there. Just as we did with the previous example then, we can compare this measure with the original one by subtracting this value from the average runtime. So let's just quickly copy and paste our average runtime versus sci-fi measure. Save a tiny little bit of time. And then we can create a new measure, paste in all the code we've just copied, and then just change its name to say average runtime versus sci-fi PG. We then just need to make sure that we're comparing it against the correct measure, so average runtime sci-fi PG. And then when we enter the result, we can swap out the measure used in that second matrix to display the answer. There's one additional complication with this one, in that not every combination of genre and certificate actually produces a value for the average runtime. So we've got quite a lot of negative 117.71 values here. I think we should add an if function just to make sure that we're only calculating this result if the original average runtime is not blank. So let's just add just this measure to say if, and then we'll say not is blank, and then refer to the original average runtime measure, and as long as that condition is true, then we'll calculate the average runtime minus average runtime sci-fi PG. We don't need to provide the third argument. If we don't provide the third argument, we'll return a blank, which is exactly what I wanted. So let's just update that measure and see that we return blanks there instead. In terms of visualizing this, I think data bars in the matrix might be a little bit confusing. Let's use a background color instead. I'm going to right click on the measure in the values bucket in the field well, choose conditional formatting, and then choose background color. I'm going to use a color gradient and set the lowest value to be colored in orange, and then the highest value can be colored in blue. I want to format any empty cells not as the value 0 would be colored in. I don't want to format that at all. So let's choose don't format for that option. And then for the middle color, let's set a middle color of white. Okay, so we can click OK at that point. Then it's a little easier to see at a glance which combinations of genres and certificates have a much higher or a much lower average runtime compared to science fiction PG movies. So replacing a filter is actually quite straightforward. We simply add a filter argument which references a column which is already being used to apply a filter. But what if that's not quite what we wanted to do? What if we want to retain the original filter context and then add a new filter to it using the same column? To demonstrate what I mean by that, let's create a new report page. And in that page I'm going to add a new table, and I'll show the genre field. And then I'd like to create a new measure for this section. I want to create a measure which shows the total runtime of our films. So let's add a new measure to the all measures table. We'll call this one total runtime. I'll spell that correctly eventually, and we'll use the sum function to get the sum of runtime minutes. We can then add that new measure into our table, and then I'll just bump up the font size a little bit again so we can see what's going on. Okay, what I'd now like to do is create a new measure that shows the total runtime using the science fiction genre. So let's do as we did earlier on. I'll create a new measure, and I'll call this one total runtime sci-fi. And then I'm going to use the calculate function, and just as we did earlier on, I'm going to reference my existing measure, total runtime, and then ask where the genre field equals science fiction. So we're going to get the same basic result here as we saw last time, of course. This new filter argument that we've just created here will replace the existing filter context for each row in the table visual and simply show me the total runtime for science fiction films next to every single genre. So this isn't quite yet what I wanted. At the moment, the measure is calculating the total runtime of science fiction films and displaying that next to each individual genre. What I really want to do is calculate the total runtime, but only in the science fiction genre. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one, I think. So of course, the reason we're getting this set of results, as we know already, is that when we reference a column in a filter expression, it destroys any existing filter on that column. So basically the Western genre, when we're calculating this measure, doesn't know that it's the Western genre because we've destroyed that filter context. All it knows to do is to calculate the sum of runtime for the science fiction genre and display that result. To modify this, we need to tell this measure to keep any filters already applied to the genre column. And to do that, it's actually quite simple. There's a function designed for exactly this purpose called KeepFilters. If we wrap the KeepFilters function around this filter expression, this will not destroy any existing filter using any columns you mention. It will simply add to it. So I'm going to say KeepFilters genre science fiction. And then if I update that measure, we should see quite a big difference now. So we can see that the only genre that's calculating the total runtime is science fiction because the original filter context hasn't been removed. So why is this sort of thing useful? Well, one possible reason is to create a measure with a pre-filtered list of categories. Let's say, for example, it wasn't just science fiction films we were interested in. We wanted to build a list of the total runtimes for our favourite genres or the best genres. Let's modify the name of the measure so it says total runtimes best genres. And then, rather than just asking where the genre is equal to science fiction, I'm going to replace the equals operator with the in operator and then wrap a set of curly brackets or braces around science fiction. Then I can write a comma-separated list of the other genres that I'm interested in. You definitely don't have to use the same ones as I'm using here. So let's go with fantasy. And then let's have one more as well. Let's go for martial arts. So comma-separated list in some double quotes. Okay, so if I update this measure now, what we should see is that in the background in this table, we're getting the total runtime for just our selected genres. This becomes a bit more useful if we don't display the original total runtime measure as well. Let's just remove that from the table, and we can see that that automatically filters that table to show only the genres we're interested in. And this applies to pretty much any visual we choose to include in the report. If I decide I want to show a bar chart, and I want to include the genres, and then I want to include the total runtimes for just my favourite genres, then it will only show those three genres whenever I add that measure in. So it's a pre-filtered list of genre categories. This technique works equally well if we want to exclude some categories from our measure. Let me just change this table so that it shows all the genres again. I'll just re-include the total runtime measure. There are definitely some genres in here that I would want to exclude from this list, like awful films, for example. To do this, we can copy and paste the total runtimes best genres measure, and then create a new measure, and then paste in all that code. And I think a name for this one could be total runtimes excluding worst genres. Again, you can pick a different list to me if you like, just to demonstrate the principle. I want to do this without using the KeepFilters function, just again to demonstrate why we need to use this. So I'm going to get rid of the KeepFilters function first, and then I'll change the genre list to say not genre in, and then let's go for the awful genre. That can definitely disappear. We can get rid of, I'm going to get rid of horror movies as well. I'm not a big fan of horror movies. I'm too much of a scaredy cat. And then let's go for romance films as well. I don't think there's much need for romance films in the world. Let's get rid of those. The problem here, of course, is that we're using a filter expression that references the column that's already applying a filter. So this is going to replace the existing filter with our new one that we've just created. So if I just swap out the fields being used there and go for total runtimes excluding worst genres instead, we'll see that it doesn't get rid of the awful genre, sadly. It keeps it in there and it just calculates the total runtime for all the genres except for awful, except for horror, except for romance, which isn't what we wanted, of course. So let's go back and change that measure to include the KeepFilters function. So I'll add KeepFilters back in again. The expression, the filter itself, doesn't change at all. We just need to wrap the KeepFilters function around the filter, update the measure, and we'll see, finally, fortunately, happily, awful films now no longer exist. Finally, it's worthwhile mentioning that you can include the KeepFilters function multiple times in the same measure. To demonstrate this, let's create a new page in the report, and I'm going to add a new matrix which will show the country field in the rows area, and then the genre field in the columns area, and then our total runtimes best genres in the values area. That will automatically filter the genres field to just those that we're interested in. I'll just increase the font size a little here as well so it's a little easier to see what's going on. Now I'd like to add another filter which will only show the countries which don't begin with the word United. So I'm going to exclude United Kingdom and United States. To make that work, I'm going to start with our existing measure, total runtimes best genres. So let's just copy all of that and then create a new measure in the all measures table, paste everything in, and I'm going to call this one total runtimes best genres not United. All I need to do here is add another filter to the calculate function. So I'll add a comma after the first KeepFilters function. And then just to do this once again without using the KeepFilters function, I want to find countries that do not contain string. And then I'm going to look in the country column for the string United using an asterisk character as the wildcard. So basically anything that does not begin with United. Now if I do that without the KeepFilters function, we're referencing a country column in a filter expression where the country column is already exerting a filter on the measure. So if I update that measure now and replace what's in this matrix, we're going to see that it doesn't remove United Kingdom and United States, it replaces the filter for United Kingdom and United States and gives us the total runtime for all the countries except for those two. So once again, the solution to this is the KeepFilters function. If I add KeepFilters above this new filter I've just written, and then close the extra set of round brackets for that, updating the measure now gives us exactly what we want. It excludes the United Kingdom and the United States. So there we go, there's some basic information about replacing and keeping filters in your measures. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.